Hey, George, you're a scientist.
I'm a chemist, yes.
Right, you're a scientist. So I was thinking, we've talked a lot about oh, how much energy is in this system and how does this material work and stars and all kinds of big magic-y stuff. And then that got me thinking about actual magic. So you play D&D and the quintessential D&D spell, if you're over 45, is Magic Missile. But if you're under 45, it's Fireball because that's the spell everybody takes. It's super broken and does an insane amount of damage compared to every other spell at that level. How much energy would actually be released by the D&D spell Fireball?
Well, darn it, Lions. I'm a chemist, not a TTRPG physicist, which, I mean, probably exists, right?
Definitely.
But with my very limited background and very limited knowledge and expertise, I will attempt to opine to this. So, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to figure out what is a man other than a miserable pile of secrets.
A smoldering crater, hopefully.
Well, kind of, because basically is I was like, okay, what I need to do is find a way to get from energy to hit points, right? So, there's no great way to do that, right? So what I did, and honestly, I tried a couple of different ways. And to be fair, there's probably a way more math intensive way to do this, but I stood upon the shoulders of giants and allowed some other people to do some work for me. So let's talk about Mike Tyson for a second. So
all right.
Yeah. So Mike Tyson is from what I could tell from the several websites I visited, I couldn't find the ultimate source of this. So all of this could be made up, but everything's made up. So, but a couple of different sources said that Mike Tyson's punch, when he hits something, carries about 1,600 joules of energy, right? So because a lot of things were like, oh well, this much force, and I was like, yeah, but I'm trying to get it into energy, and so when you put it into energy, a lot of it, the things you need to know is well, what's the mass of the arm and so on and so forth. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to go with Mike Tyson, 1,600 joules. Now, so when he hits somebody, he hits them with 1,600 joules of energy. So then the question is, in D&D parlance, what would we say is happening there? Well, we're obviously going with 5e rules, right? So how much D&D damage would you argue that Mike Tyson's doing?
If Mike Tyson punched someone, I'm going to say in the face with no boxing glove on, how much damage is he doing?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe 1 or 2 hit points. You can punch someone to death, but it would take more than one big punch, right? Unless you broke their neck. So
sure.
He can't. Even 1 hit point, if you only have 10 hit points, to knock 10% of your life off with a single punch feels. I don't think he's punching that hard. Not when you measure it that way.
Sure. And that's the thing, right? Is that I was like, okay, well, if we look at the feats available in D&D, I would argue that Mike Tyson is a trained fighter. Since
he is a trained fighter. that one feels like a gimme, but I'm glad we still included it for science.
Yeah, you got to set the foundation, man. So I would assume that he, as a fighter, he took the fighting style of unarmed combat, right? Which means
also checks out, yes.
Since he doesn't wield a shield, which would be awesome looking, but he doesn't do. It means that he is dealing 1d8 damages, 1d8 plus strength. I assumed that his strength was an 18 because not a 20 because that's the maximum that humans can achieve. And he's not the strongest person in the world. He's just very strong, So I was like, okay, so that means he's dealing 1d8 plus 4 damage. Now you can scale this. So that's a range, right? So you can scale this up and scale it back. But ultimately, this is all kind of order of magnitude stuff anyway. So you'll see when we get to the end that even if we are more generous than this, it doesn't wildly change the answer. But that means that in a punch, he does 12 damage, because if he hits you, basically, and to your point, right, is that's he hit you as hard as he can, dead in the face, right? Which, potentially could concuss somebody, kill them, whatever, right? And also too, that assumes that we're level 1 commoners, where it's like, we might have some additional hit points. So that means that 1 hit point, if your body takes 133 joules, you will be reduced by 1 hit point, right? So 133 joules of energy is 1 hit point's worth of damage. So again, even if you were to drop it down by 1, it would multiply by 12, which would, in theory, multiply your end result by about 10. So we can keep that number in the back of our head of, if we wanted to be as generous as possible and say that Mike Tyson deals 1 hit point of damage when he hits you, the same as you or me, because that's the thing, is that, like, if you're not trained, then it's 1 hit point plus strength, So anyways, so 133 joules is 1 hit point. So a fireball deals 8d6 damage, which is a lot. But on average, that means it's only 28 damages, per fireball. And in theory, that means that would be enough to, that would be about 133 times 28 joules worth of energy, right? And that's really a really disappointing amount of energy. So I was like, that can't be right. And then I remembered that fireball is an AoE. So what we really need to say is how much possible damage could fireball do? Because it doesn't do 28 damage. It deals 28 damage to everybody.
Right. Okay. So if you pack more people into that volume, you are technically adding energy to the system.
Which is wild, right? And that's how, like, I knew that all of this breaks down, is that the fireball becomes more powerful the more people it hits. And I was like, well, that's funny, and none of this is right, but whatever, let's do this thing. So at first I was like, okay, I saw a fireball, like the 20-foot radius drawn out, and it's like, it would impact these squares. And I was like, okay, so each one of those I'm going to assume is a 5-foot cube, as opposed to a 5-foot square, which can house one medium-sized creature. And I was like, okay. And I was like, but it also needs to be, it's not just the area, it's got to be tall too, because that's the full fireball that happened in 3 dimensions. And then I so quickly lost my appetite for trying to figure out exactly how many cubes that was, that because I was looking at it and literally I was like, well, I guess you could approximate it this way, or you could do this. And then all of a sudden I remembered that the thing that Newton did, more so than discovering gravity, that made him absolutely famous was squaring the circle, basically using limit functions to actually get the area underneath a curve. And I was like, oh, I'm definitely not doing calculus to figure this out.
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't that a differential equation?
Yes. And I was like, no, we're not doing that. So what I did instead was I was like, okay, I'm just going to do cubic feet to cubic feet. So for every 125 cubic feet, we've established that it does 28 damage, right? Because that's one person. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to take a sphere with a radius of 20 feet, which has 33,510 cubic feet of volume. I'm like, and then just divide that by 125. So like that's, again, these are all kind of order of magnitude numbers, but long story short, that gives you 223 people that could potentially occupy that sphere. That's a fair number of people.
Yeah. Do you have to cut that in half to account for a floor? Are we assuming that these are all flying enemies?
Oh, yeah, no, like these are all flying enemies. This is the maximum amount of damage.
Okay, yes. So that this is detonating a fireball in the center of a sphere full of enemies.
Yes, but there's a small tube of toilet paper, right? Like a long tube that goes in, so you have line of sight into the center.
Perfect.
Because you have, let's not get weird. Okay, you've got to have line of sight.
Obviously,
right?
It's right there in the rules.
Yeah, come on. If there's one thing we need to do is rigorously follow the rules. So at 223 people, 28 damage per cube. That brings you to about 6,255 damage, which that's a lot of damage, in D&D world. But as we said, is that the conversion is 133 joules per for each of these. So that's 831 kilojoules of energy, which again sounds like a lot of energy, right? But that is the equivalent of 198 grams of TNT, or about half a stick of TNT. And isn't that so disappointing?
Okay, here's the thing. I'm imagining, like, you ever watch like Mythbusters or something, they blow stuff up.
Mm-hmm.
And like, you see something explode and you think about how many people nearby would have gotten hurt by that. And that actually doesn't feel that wrong. Like if you had a bunch of bodies packed around a stick of dynamite, like the force would get absorbed by all those people. And if you were 25 or 30 feet away, like the people might get knocked into you, but the blast, the energy from the blast hit them, not you, right? And then a lot of that was absorbed into their meat, which has now been cooked, and like they get knocked onto you, but that's not the same as being 25 feet away of open air between, with something that explodes. So like that, it's disappointing in the like Fireball is always described as this like cataclysmic like battle ender, and yet it doesn't actually feel that wrong.
Right. And so also too, the thing with Fireball is that it's like it magically like and insanely briefly fills the area with fire because it deals fire damage, not force damage, which is, like
what an explosion would do.
Right, because we're like, oh man, I threw a grenade, so that deals like fire damage, right? And it's like, no, it deals piercing damage because it's the shrapnel that gets you, and it's like, oh, that's awful. So about half a stick of TNT. But here's where, so that's the answer. Then I was like, okay, how dumb can I possibly make this, right? So
he said after almost doing calculus to discover how much energy there is in the spell Fireball, then at that point said to himself, how dumb can I make this?
Well, and so as we kind of discussed, like if you wanted to really lowball Tyson's damage and say that he dealt 1 damage, right? Then that would bring you up to, about 10 times that amount, right? So instead of half a stick, it would be 5 sticks of TNT, right? But here's the weird bit, is that as you kind of mentioned, is as you add people, it gets bigger, right? It gets the damage gets more. So what if you were doing it to tiny sized creatures? Because they can do 4 by 4 by 4, right? So that means that for every square, instead of having 1 person, you would have 8 people.
So this is like setting off dynamite in like a cloud of pixies.
Yeah, basically, which makes sense because that's why they're flying,
That's right.
So, yes, you're proving my point, right? So, the long and the short of it is that if you assume that Mike Tyson only deals 1 damage and that you're dealing with tiny pixies, right, then you can get up to around 40 sticks of TNT, which feels more like, yeah, that blows some people apart, right?
There's something, I feel almost trite saying this, but inherently magical about the idea that it's like, well, the spell does damage in this radius, but it doesn't damage stuff, right? Like Fireball won't blow apart like a house, I don't think.
I don't think it hits like unattended objects.
Yeah.
But Firebolt will set unattended objects on fire, but I don't think Fireball does.
Yeah. Which means it is not straining credulity to say, oh, well, the more people are there, the more damage it does. It's like, no, that is rules as written. Like if you are in the blast area, it's not like that damage goes somewhere else. It doesn't go into the environment if there aren't creatures there, and 1 creature doesn't absorb all that damage because it's an AoE. So it's magic. It is literally and figuratively magic.
Well, and that's why, because for the initial one where I said, okay, how many people can we fit in? The idea was that just because a space isn't occupied, there's still the energy there doing work, right? So I was like, okay, we would need to figure out like if every square was getting the damage, what would be the total force? But then as I was thinking about it, I said like, well, then to your point is it was the more people you can somehow cram in. So I was like, well, if the people were smaller, and then so that's that's how I got to there. But the interesting thing, I think, is that, and this kind of goes back to one of the other kind of theories of D&D, is that, like, in the universe, you could say, like, magic kind of isn't real, where it's like, I cast Fireball, a small little mote of flame goes in, and then boom, explodes. And it's just like somebody just hucking M80s, like, at their at people they don't like, And they're like, I'm a magician. It's like, no, you made black powder in your basement, and now you're telling everybody that you're a magician, and we have to deal with it, Dave, because we want you to throw the M80s.
Abrac explosion. Oh man, this reminds me of several other players' handbooks worth of spells I wanted to ask you about.